Another aspect of our consciousness is our ability to think, and very often when we think about thinking, we think about intelligence. So I just want to say something really briefly about thinking. The book does a good job of talking about some of the pitfalls of our thinking. So the reality is that we are susceptible to a lot of cognitive biases. So the book talks about things like the confirmation bias, or putting things in different frames and how that changes the way that we think about them. So please read the book to learn more about that portion. But I do want to talk a little bit about the idea of intelligence. And one of the reasons I want to talk about this is because it's an extremely volatile topic when you talk to a psychologist. There's very poor consistency in what people think about when they think about intelligence. So really, the definition changes from person to person and from textbook to textbook. So you can look in our textbook and see what they think intelligence is, but keep in mind that this isn't what exactly everyone thinks intelligence is, which from a scientific perspective is kind of problematic that we don't all agree. But regardless of the fact that we don't agree, there is a lot of research about intelligence. So first I want to start with where intelligence comes from. Is it genetic is a question that a lot of people want to know. Is it the case that we are born smart or we are born not smart? And when you test the same person twice, this is a correlation. Remember the correlation coefficients that we talked about? You get a 0.87 correlation, meaning that there's a strong positive correlation from when I take an intelligence test now and maybe again in a year. So this is the baseline that we're going to compare it with. What we're going to do to test whether intelligence is genetic is look at twins, because twins have a unique situation where they share, especially identical twins, identical DNA. So when you test identical twins on intelligence tests, you get a correlation of 0.86, which is really high, especially in comparison into our baseline of 0.87. What this means is that different people who have the same genetic makeup have very, very similar test scores, almost as similar as the same person taking the test twice. This really indicates that there is a genetic component. When you measure fraternal twins, these are non-identical twins, that drops to 0.55, which is still a relationship but not nearly as strong, indicating that there is something about the genetic component. Just as a couple other comparisons, biological siblings tend to have a correlation of 0.47, and unrelated children have a correlation of 0.30. So what this tells us is that there is some genetic component to our intelligence levels, but of course that's not the only component. When we talk about nature and nurture, we know that nature and nurture influence our behavior at all times. So how do we measure intelligence? Well, there are lots of different tests out there. One of the most popular, or one of the first, was the Stanford-Binet test of intelligence. And here are some sample items from this test. So the way this test works is there are questions that you should be able to answer if you are a certain age. So there's an example question here for a 2-year-old, for a 6-year-old, for a 14-year-old, etc. So they think that a 12-year-old should be able to know what regret means and say what that is. The way that these tests work is that you start at a low question and keep going until a person that you're testing gets one wrong, and then another wrong, and then another wrong, and they go back to the last question that was answered correctly, and that's what they refer to as a person's mental age. And when you're talking about IQ, what you're doing is you're comparing a person's mental age, the age of their brain, to their biological, actual age. If their mental age is above their biological age, they're going to have a higher IQ than the average person. And if their mental age is below their actual age, then you'll have a lower IQ. A person whose mental age perfectly matches their biological age is going to have a very average IQ. Another example of an intelligence test is something called the Wechsler Adults Intelligence Test, or the WAIS. This is a test that's very frequently used in the judicial system. All people who go to stand trial for some kind of crime that they've been accused of are given an intelligence test to see if they are fit to stand trial. So here you can see in the top left there are some verbal questions, there are some picture-related questions. The SAT is also an intelligence test, though you might not think about it as such, and those of you who took this in high school know that there is a verbal component and a quantitative component. So are there any group differences in the kind of intelligence levels that we see? This is a really interesting and sometimes hot button issue in the United States, because you do see consistently across time and across regions differences between three major racial groups. So the African American average is 85, the Caucasian American average of IQ is 100, and the Asian American average is 110. So on average you see these in scores all the time, and there's been a lot of debate about why. Why are there differences between different racial groups? So here are a few hypotheses that might dictate or might help us understand where these come from. The first hypothesis that was proposed was a genetic hypothesis. Because we know intelligence is fairly genetic, maybe there's something genetically different about the racial groups. This idea has been popular in the United States for a very long time. If you think back to the founding of our country, when we relied heavily on slavery for our economy, there were a lot of people who argued that African Americans were less intelligent or less human even than white Americans, and that was a tool of our ability to repress a specific group, right? In order to make one group do your bidding and treat them awfully, you need to feel like or think that they are less than you. So this has been an idea that's been out there for a long time, that somehow black people aren't as smart as white people and white people aren't as smart as Asian people, and that's genetic and that's just the way it is. There has been research to look at this, of course, especially since we've been able to map the genome and look at different genetics, and thus far there's no evidence to support this. We cannot find an intelligence gene that differs from racial groups. In fact, the genetics between racial groups is so similar that it would be very challenging to find something like this. So this hypothesis has not received any support. Another hypothesis is that there's something about the environment that's different between the groups. So for example, we know that some groups have better access to education than others, and that's often related to economic status. And the unfortunate reality is that most of the people in this country who are at or below the poverty level are ethnic minorities, in particular African Americans or Hispanic Americans. This can decrease the availability of quality education, and if you go to a poor school, you're going to end up with poorer outcomes than if you go to a rich school, because rich schools are able to do things like pay teachers very well to keep the best. They're able to buy textbooks and computers, and there's a different culture than there are in poorer schools. This is one of the issues that the No Child Left Behind and subsequent efforts to change education has been trying to address, is how can we make poor area schools better so that students in them can have better educations. So when you get a good education, you end up with a higher intelligence level. So that's one of the environmental or the nurture effects, and this has received some support. The third hypothesis is that IQ tests are biased. So the reality is that they are written by middle-aged white guys who have a fair amount of money demographically. And not that there's anything wrong with middle-aged, well-off white guys, but they have a different experience than other groups. They have a different experience than young women. They have a different experience than African Americans. They have different subjective ways of viewing the world, and that impacts the kinds of questions that they write. So let's go back to our WAIS and see if we can see any cultural bias in this. The first major cultural bias is that it's all in English. If you had to take a test, an intelligence test in a language that you didn't understand, you would do quite poorly. So sometimes that's an issue when we talk about immigration in this country. But even if you do speak English, there's some questions that might not be as clear. So for example, what day of the year is Independence Day? If you have just recently come to the United States, you might not know the answer to this. Does that mean you're stupid? No, it simply means that you don't know the rules or the customs yet. Why do people buy fire insurance? Well, this is a bias in terms of the fact that people in the United States who buy fire insurance are homeowners. Renters don't have to worry about fire insurance, so it's possible that a person who is a renter doesn't have a lot of experience with fire insurance. And we have this picture arrangement over here where you have to put it in a certain order of a child making a snowman. And there are some people who don't see snow or don't know about snow. People who live in Alaska would know a lot about snow. People who live in Arizona maybe less. So it might be harder for somebody to understand this kind of question if they don't have personal experience with it. Another kind of bias that happens is a phenomenon called the stereotype threat. And the stereotype threat happens when you ask a person to either check their racial group or their gender before taking an IQ test. So if you have two groups, an experiment where one condition of people takes an intelligence test without answering a question about their racial group beforehand, and another group who takes an intelligence test where they do have to check off their racial group beforehand, what you see is that in the group where they didn't have to say their racial group, the different races score equally. But when you put them into that situation where they had to check their racial group, African Americans score worse, Asian Americans score better, which is a very interesting phenomenon. And the argument is that when we're reminded of our racial group, we're also reminded of all the biases and stereotypes that come with being part of that racial group. And just that reminder can influence the way that we behave. The same happens with gender. If you're asked to check whether you're male or female, males tend to do better on things like math tests where females do worse, whereas you don't see those differences if you didn't ask about their gender. So one of the major debates in psychology is how many intelligences are there? So there's one theory that says basically there's one. It's called the G factor, and there's different components that kind of help make it up, but either you have this intelligence or you don't. This is what a lot of our educational system is based on, is a sort of one idea of intelligence. It's very based in math and in the language arts. The counter to that is the theory of multiple intelligences, which has been proposed by Howard Gardner. Gardner says that there are numerous intelligences. The first, he says, is verbal intelligence, and an example of this might be someone like Emily Dickinson, who is a poet, somebody who has a very good command of words, who has a good vocabulary, who's able to write well, who's able to read and comprehend well. The second he calls logical mathematical. And Einstein would be a good example of this, anybody who's good at math or science. And these first two look familiar because this is what we often base school on. But Gardner says that's not the end of the list. There's quite a few more. There's musical intelligence, so someone like Beethoven, someone who's born with perfect pitch, which is the ability to hear a sound and know exactly what tone or what note that's in. Spatial intelligence, so artists, someone like Picasso might have high spatial intelligence. This could be related to your ability to understand directions, to be able to draw maps and know where you are in the physical world. There's bodily kinesthetics, so world-class athletes, someone like Tiger Woods, who make their bodies do extraordinary things. A lot of us don't have the ability for our brain to control our bodies in such small ways that we can do the phenomenal athletic endeavors that people like this do. Then there's self or intrapersonal intelligence, our ability to know about ourselves or think about our internal processes. So Freud's a good example of this because, of course, he founded psychology by thinking about his own processes. Then there's social or interpersonal, which someone like Oprah might have. This is the idea that you can understand social situations, navigate amongst people very well. And then finally, naturalistic intelligence, which someone like Charles Darwin would have. So regardless of how you feel about his theory of evolution, he basically created this theory off of just hanging out with some birds on an island and noticing that they had different beaks, and created an entire idea, an entire theory that changed science very dramatically. So understanding how the natural world works, this might be someone who's fairly in tune with the seasons, so farmers might have more naturalistic intelligence. And the argument that Gardner and his colleagues make is that we really miss the boat when we just focus on the first two, that we miss the people in the world who have abilities in these other intelligence areas because we don't focus on them on school and we don't support them.